You had guys who were given the choice if they were in trouble to either go to jail or join the army. You had guys who didn't want to go to college or whatnot. The draft got them. Some volunteered. It was very few situations where you could get away just by saying, I don't want to go.
Welcome back to Still Standing, where we honor those who serve and speak truth about the battles that continue long after the uniform comes off. Today, we're looking back on one of the most televised, debated, and misunderstood wars in American history, the Vietnam War. For many veterans, this wasn't just a war fought in the jungles, but also a war fought in their minds, their homes, their bodies, and their hearts for decades after the war ended. We'll explore how exploitation, negligence, and trauma shaped an entire generation of service members and what their struggles teach us today about resilience, recognition, and recovery. But that's the next episode. So come back. My name is Christina Augustine, and I am a peer support specialist here at the Hope Center. And I am joined by
Robert Augustine, peer support specialist, Hope Center.
Ray Lewis. I'm an outreach case manager for Hope Center.
So in 1965, the Vietnam War became America's first televised war. You know, they don't even televise wars now. So this was something amazing. And every night, millions of families sat in their living rooms watching footage from the front lines. Why they would want their children to see that, I don't know, because this footage was not doctored in any kind of way, cut off or blurred or anything. I don't think they even had those capabilities back then. Everything was upfront and pure. They saw helicopters landing, villages burning, and young soldiers caught in chaos. And the worst part about it is everything that they saw, we know what we see on TV is edited in some kind of way, and it can't tell you the truth behind what's going on. Like why would they burn down an entire village that has women and children in it? So, but while the world watched, few truly saw what the soldiers really endured. What the broadcast didn't show was the confusion, the conflict, the moral wounds, and the isolation that lingered long after the cameras stopped filming. When those soldiers came home, they weren't welcomed. There was no parade, no fanfare. They were protested against. They were misunderstood. They were rejected, sometimes by their own families. And in some cases, they were blamed for the war itself.
When we talk about the exploitation of U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War, it wasn't about what happened in combat. It was about the decision made long before they ever stepped foot in the jungle. Let's start with leadership. General William C. Westmore. C is for Charles. He was born in March 26, 1914, in Spartanburg County, South Carolina. He died July 15, 2005. General Westmoreland considered himself to be a strategic commander who commanded U.S. forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, believed victory would come through sheer numbers, what he called attrition warfare. The goal was to wear down the enemy through continuous engagements, measuring success not by territory gain, but by body counts. This strategy came at a devastating cost. Under Westmoreland command, U.S. troops levels soared from about 23,000 to more than 500,000 soldiers by 1968. At that time, he requisitioned Congress for more troops. The escalation of support by President Lyndon B. Johnson, who sent more than 200,000 additional troops into one of the largest mobilizations of war. But where did all those soldiers come from? The draft. You had guys who were given the choice if they were in trouble to either go to jail or join the army. You had guys who didn't want to go to college or whatnot. The draft got them. And some volunteered. It was very few situations where you could get away just by saying, I don't want to go. You will probably be going to jail anyway. Thousands of young men, many from working class families, were pulled off their homes and sent into the conflict they didn't fully understand. For some, avoiding the draft was impossible. Others, particularly from wealthier, connected families, found ways out. That imbalance left a generation of ordinary Americans, often poor, rural, and underprivileged, carrying the heaviest burdens of combat. As if that wasn't enough, the Department of Defense launched Project 100,000, a recruitment initiative meant to fill the troops shortage by lowering estimated standards. Never outpromised, underdelivered, General Westmoreland should have followed the advice when he addressed the National Press Club 50 years ago. Instead, the commanding general of the U.S. Armed Forces in Vietnam gave his audience an upbeat assessment of the war in South Vietnam, going so far as to say it is at reach, where the end begins to come into view. He was strategically wrong. Westmoreland took charge of the U.S. military efforts in Vietnam in March of 1964, a highly decorated veteran of World War II and the Korean War. He looked like a general straight out of the central casting. Time magazine was so taken with him that it named him its Man of the Year in 1965. When Westmoreland first took command in Saigon, the United States had fewer than 17,000 military advisors on the ground in South Vietnam. Their job was to train and advise the South Vietnamese military in the fighting against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. Westmoreland continually pressed Washington to send combat troops. He got his wish in March of 1965 when the first Marine hit the shores of Da Nang. The American phase of Vietnam War had begun, but as President John F. Kennedy had predicted just a few years earlier, the results had been like taking a drink. The fix quickly worse off and more troops were needed. By late summer 1967, the United States had 450,000 troops in Vietnam. So his idea of just overwhelming the Vietnamese was a tragic mistake because for two things. One is that we were in their country. They knew the land. And we weren't only fighting the Vietnamese, we were fighting the guerrilla Viet Cong. Remember, we're Americans. We have dignity. We wear uniforms. We wear uniforms to determine who we are and whatnot. Our enemies don't. They don't wear uniforms. We don't know who is who or what's what, if it's South Vietnamese or North Vietnamese. So we were sent into a conflict like that. And again, a lot of the gentlemen who were drafted or made to go to Vietnam had no idea what they were going into. And as Christina said, to come home, it's like you're expecting, well, hey, I went over and fought for my country. I did right. I'm glad I didn't go to jail, trouble or whatnot. I went to defend my country. I'm a soldier. To come home, only to find that it was depressing because people would look down at you, call you baby killer, and thought you were ignorant for going when you didn't have a choice. So it was a whole thing that Westmoreland didn't think of, really didn't seem to care about. It's like to go on to say that his strategy about overwhelming the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong didn't work. The idea was to give men who had previously been disqualified another chance due to low test scores, education, or health. But in reality, it was exploitation. Many of these men received minimal training and were sent into dangerous frontline roles. Studies later showed that casualties and fatalities rates were far higher among these troops compared to regular enlistees. The Vietnam War also the first war Americans could watch from their living rooms, which back in the 60s, TV was a big new thing. Especially came out with color. I remember my mom and dad having a filter that they would put over the black and white screen and gave us an idea that we were looking at color, but everybody was glued to the TV set. So to see, you know, footage of helicopters landing in smoke, wounded soldiers crying out for medics, villages being burned to the ground, there was no filter. It just was all new. It's like war today, where you're watching the Iraqi war, and you can see the bomb or the missile going into the building's window and all that kind of stuff. Well, 50 years ago, this was big stuff. Kids could go to school the next day. Did you see that or whatnot? So we saw the devastation that it did to these villages. If we had people over in Vietnam that were for America come to liberate their country, when that bomb hits the building on the corner, it's going to mess up the building on the opposite corner. So where we had a friend or ally, we now have an enemy because now we've killed a grandmother, we've killed an aunt, uncle, a child.
Mhm.
So it was very devastating. America's looking at a lot of people. And it's like, oh yeah, we bumped them up. Oh yeah, we will. But you were killing innocent people, and this is what a lot of Americans saw. So to say while that was visible and very historic, it came as a painful twist. The nation saw soldiers' pain, but often turned that that pain into anger towards soldiers themselves, not the policymakers. When when veterans came home, they weren't greeted with gratitude. They were met with protest, rejection, and silence. For those men, they
Being
had
ghosted.
survived a war that the nation had publicly watched but refused to emotionally carry. That contradiction of being visible yet visible became one of the deepest wounds veterans brought home. The trauma didn't just come from combat, it came from the sense of betrayal, from leadership decisions that valued numbers over lives, from negligent training, and from homecoming that felt colder than the battlefield itself. And it's forms that pain that we begin to learn that the visible wounds of war can last a lifetime if left untreated.
So I just want to mention that when we talk about unfiltered footage and not being able to know the details of what's going on, when they burn a village down, there may have been that village may have been filled with families from Viet Cong soldiers or the enemy. They may have had children that were shooting at them. When you're at war, if a child is shooting at you, you're going to shoot back. You might feel bad that you killed a child, but you're going to shoot back because at that point, it's either him or you. At that time, they used women, their children, girls and boys. They didn't care because they were that dedicated to their cause. They thought they were right and we were intruding. And those poor soldiers with the negligent training, a lot of these soldiers that were drafted, anyone who has served knows that when you go into the military, you go to boot camp. Everybody has boot camp, even the Air Force. But
Mhm.
we're not going to talk about them. Sorry, y'all. I'm Army. But everybody has boot camp. And after boot camp, you go to school and you get trained for the job that you joined for. These soldiers didn't get any schooling. They went to boot camp. Boot camp was probably cut a little bit shorter because some of them were deployed before they even finished boot camp because they needed the bodies. And that means that they got the basics of warfare and physical training and then were sent to a jungle in another country to fight. That itself had to play on people's minds. And that, when Robert said, being visible yet invisible, that's a hurting and isolating feeling because you come home and people see you, but they really don't see what you've gone through. So the trauma of Vietnam ran deep and it didn't end when the war did. Um, so many veterans returned home only to find themselves in a different kind of battle, fighting nightmares, flashbacks, uh, waking up in cold sweats, and mistrust of the very country that they fought for and fought to protect. Families watched, those that didn't just totally discredit and denounce them. Their families watched as they changed. They became jumpy at sudden sounds, withdrawn. They were angry all the time. They were sometimes, they would just drink themselves until they were numb, anything to numb the pain. They didn't even have the language to describe what was going on. They didn't know what was happening to them, what they were feeling, because it just wasn't known. But out of that pain came advocacy. And I thank God for the Vietnam veterans because Vietnam veterans were the ones who they demanded better. They're the ones who pushed for PTSD to be formally recognized, who fought for veteran outreach centers, and who created the groundwork for modern trauma informed care. So without the Vietnam veterans, we wouldn't have the care that we have now today. I would still be jumping at sounds and I would still have trauma in my life and feel like I'm crazy and not having been cared for properly. I wouldn't have been able to get treatment. My children probably wouldn't even be here because I would have been just as crazy as a June bug. So Vietnam veterans now are honored, but we're talking back in the 1960s and the 1970s. And it was it was hard. I can only imagine the fight that they had to go to Congress, all the way to Congress, and say something's got to be done. We're not crazy, and it's not just me. And that leads us into an important moment in history when the invisible wounds of war finally got a name and when healing began to take shape in a new way. To help us understand that evolution from the term shell shocked to what we now know as post traumatic stress disorder, we're joined by Gary. And Mr. Gary is a mental health professional who's worked closely with veterans here at the Hope Center and elsewhere and their families for many years. Mr. Gary?
Thank you, Christina. I'm Gary Lewis, Outreach Case Manager, and we're talking for decades about PTSD. It wasn't recognized at all. Most people called it shell shock. Oh, that child is shell shock. You see how he jumps up and down? That was the definition that we gave, and we let it stay there. From 1965 to 1970, it wasn't recognized as a debilitating mental health disorder. Most of the people who were combated by shell shock were veterans, and the veterans who worked closely in Cambodia, Laos. This is where the intense fighting were. What they tried to do is mellow off. They tried to drink and do drugs, stabilizing their condition because it was horrendous. Like Mr. Roberts said, you had people running up to you and you thought they were friends and would blow up something, or you never knew. So you were always on the edge. You were always jumping. You were always afraid and meantful that what was going on. You had to be that way because we as United States, the Army, are recognized by having suits and titles and stuff like that on, sergeant, and you could see us coming, but you didn't see these enemies. And so that carried over. The soldiers that did receive the worst of it were Black and Hispanic soldiers. Those were the ones who it kind of correlates, who had the problems in court and told you, well, we're going to give you a second try and you could do this and get rid of that, just like they said earlier. It wasn't until 1970, after pressure from the Vietnam veterans came out and they advocated that the American Psychiatric Association, formerly known as Post Traumatic Stress Disorder, in 1980. Now, just remember, the war started in 1965. So you had to go through the whole gamut of rejection. Put this person in jail. Then you had people running away. You were considered a deserter on one hand, another hand, a baby killer. So you were like in the middle of all this with mental health issues. Uh, you had depression, sadness, anxiety. In most cases, the development of hypertension started. You had tuberculosis, CT scanning, and the psychological distress, depression. You didn't know. I mean, as far as the depression was concerned, 65% of the soldiers that were depressed was again Hispanic and Blacks. I mean, you had your percentage of non-blacks, but at the same token, it was the Hispanics and Black people that suffered the most and had the most that was revealed to the public. So today's the support is available for from top to bottom. As far as is concerned, is healing. The Veterans Administration, the Department of Veterans Administration, supported through the VA, the Vet Center, and the mental health services funded by the federal state law. By healing also helps locally, for example, here in Gretna. We're proud to say that in Gretna, Louisiana, the Hope Center Incorporated, we serve veterans and families through counseling, peer support, suicide prevention, and we offer resources. We walk alongside the veterans who are still processing what happened decades ago and remind them that they are not broken and they are not alone.
Thank you, Mr. Gary. That's very powerful. I didn't know two things. I didn't know that the Vietnam veterans fight resulted in the development of CT scanning. And I also didn't know that 65% of the soldiers that were diagnosed with PTSD were minorities, which was the
Yes,
population that was affected by the draft,
Black
mostly
and
affected by
Hispanic.
the draft, I will say, because minorities didn't have money to send their children to college a lot of times back then. And you said when the war started in 65, I just want to note that we think the war started in 65 because that's when they started sending all those extra troops and televising it. But I looked it up and the war actually started 10 years earlier in
55.
55, 1955. And even though those soldiers were over there as trainers and consultants or whatever they want to call them, the 17,000 that they originally sent, they still had trauma. They still saw people getting blown up. They still saw children dying, babies, women, grandmothers, like you said, they still saw all of this. So they had to live with their trauma for 25 years before it was actually formally diagnosed. So
Exactly.
we have a lot to thank the Vietnam veterans for. Back to you, Mr. Robert.
Yeah, just closing this out. Vietnam turned out to be a tragedy for a lot of families, both American wise and then Vietnamese. So it was a senseless war. You know, we Americans are considered in a lot of cases as the world police. You know, we have to go and be involved in some things to try and so say better other people's lives or whatnot. But you have some people that stand as statistics, you know, just in some for years later for a president or someone in Congress to say, hey, we're sorry, you know. So this General Westmoreland thought he was doing the best thing possible. He was given the deal of being in charge of the military in Vietnam, and what he thought in his chess game was that if he just got a lot of people, he could just take over the country and America would be successful and everybody would be happy. And that's not the way it turned out. You have today, people are still finding things out about war, especially about Vietnam and soldiers and what goes on inside and what happens after you take off the uniform.
Mm.
So again, thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for our next episode. Please feel free to submit any questions, any thoughts you guys may have that you want us to look into or whatnot. And I hope we've been helpful in some ways. So with that, so long.
Well, to every Vietnam veteran that is listening or watching, we want to say thank you. Thank you so, so much for your service, for your struggles, and for the lives that you've saved, the policies that you changed, and the things that you've given countless others the courage to reach out for help. We say thank you. We always thank our veterans of all times for watching or listening. But today we just really wanted to honor our Vietnam veterans, especially. If you are a veteran or a family member of a veteran that's struggling today, please remember you're not alone. A lot of us have been there. You can call the crisis hotline. The Veterans Crisis Line is if you dial 988, then press 1. 988 is the national crisis line, but if you press 1, you will be connected to a veteran, a fellow veteran to talk to. Or you can reach out to your local peer support network. Or you can visit the VA. Here in New Orleans, if you visit the VA emergency room between 7 and 3 on Monday through Friday, there is a healthcare professional, a mental health care professional on staff for appointments. And if you're near Gretna, Louisiana, visit the Hope Center. Give us a call. We're here to walk with you, to listen, and to remind you that healing is still possible. Look at me. I turned out okay. Come on now. So until next time, I'd like to say please like, subscribe, love, share, do all those things with our podcast and let others hear our stories and begin to understand us. I'm Christina Augustine, and this is Still Standing, where we honor the courage it takes to keep moving forward.